All right, Abhi, we are live on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining our live. Good morning. And
Right.
Abhi, can we wait a few seconds? Just
Sure,
our viewers can join us. It's early morning here.
sure.
Oh, mhm. How are you doing, Abhi?
Doing well. It is late evening here. It's just after 10 p.m. On the
Mm-hmm.
east coast of the U.S. But things have been good here, and it's a very quiet evening in Washington, D.C.
Oh, happy to hear it. Oh, our viewer join us. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining our live. Hope you are all doing great and well these days. And our virtual programming today is dedicated to Martin Luther King Jr. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Abhi Goyal. He is former Fulbright scholar, and today he will make a online presentation about Martin Luther King, and he will highlight about his legacy and impact. So thank you very much, Abby, for accepting our invitation and being our guest speaker. It's so great to have you today. And also, I want to kindly remind our dear viewers, so you have an opportunity to ask your questions during the live. So please type them in the comment section. And I think we can start. And the floor is yours, Abby.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be talking with you all again and to get to contribute to the Bishkek American Center.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. today, as you said. On Monday of this week, the United States celebrated Martin Luther King Day. This is a federal holiday, which means it's one of the primary holidays every year where people usually don't work, and it's a day in remembrance of him. But it's also not just about him, it's about the legacy that he represents and the historical mission that he undertook. Uh, so to start with why we celebrate this holiday, we should also we should start with talking about who Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was. We remember him more than anything as a civil rights leader, which I'll explain what that means in the U.S. in a little bit and expand on that. But within the political movement, the civil rights movement, he was a speaker, he was a writer, he was an organizer. He organized parts of the movement to take action. And he was also a preacher. He came from a religious tradition, and his religion was connected with his civil rights activity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Uh, I also have to mention that he was a father, because I think a lot of times we remember his historical legacy, and it's easy to forget that he was a real person. He had a family, he was very proud of them, and a lot of what he did was driven by his love for them. And it's important to remember that he was a complete person, that he had a life of his own when we remember all of the things that he did. So here's why we celebrate Martin Luther King Day. Well, first of all, when we celebrate it to close to his birthday every year, which was January 15th. And we always have the third Monday of every month as the holiday, which would be the Monday after his birthday every year. Coretta Scott King, who was another civil rights leader and Dr. King's wife, after he was killed, campaigned for years to the government to make his birthday a holiday. The reason she did that was because she didn't want his efforts and his legacy to be forgotten. And so after several years of campaigning to political leaders, her work meant that they did indeed make his birthday a holiday. She's spoken about this before, and she calls it a day on, not a day off. Day off is colloquial English when we say when we're talking about holidays. Usually when we talk about a holiday, we call it a day off, as in it's a day off work, off of your obligations, a day to relax. She called it a day on because, unlike other holidays, this is a holiday that should remind us of the things that we need to still do to improve society and our communities, and to fight for equality every year. And I'll talk a little bit more about his legacy and why there was a campaign to make his birthday a holiday in the first place. But first, I'll talk a little about his life and where he came from. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia. That's one of the largest cities in the US. And Atlanta is very connected to the history of the Black American struggle for civil rights. There were many other civil rights leaders from Atlanta or who lived there. And to this day, they celebrate a lot about that history. And it's in the state Georgia in the southern US. He was raised in a religious family, a Baptist family. A lot of Americans are Christians, and Baptist is one denomination of Christian. And he comes from a Baptist tradition. His father was a religious leader, and he himself was also a religious leader. And we in the Baptist faith, they call those leaders reverends. He attended Morehouse College, and that's what we call an HBCU. HBCU means historically Black colleges and universities. So the United States, of course, is known for its universities and its very massive education system. But Black Americans could not always attend US universities whether it was because of the cost of education or because of discrimination. A lot of universities simply would not admit Black students. The HBCUs were a series of colleges specifically for Black Americans. And to this day, they mostly have Black student bodies and are still connected to that history. So sometimes you might hear Americans today talk about HBCUs when they're talking about education as a way to conduct education in a way that specifically benefits the Black community. And there's a picture of him on his wedding day with Coretta Scott, who, like I said, she fought for his birthday to be made a holiday. So all of this comes back to the civil rights movement. And actually, I made a small mistake in my title there. But the civil rights movement was the struggle in the first half, or in the middle of the 20th century in the United States, for Black Americans to get back many of their rights. In the first half of the century, Black Americans were denied many of their rights. They were prevented from attending the same schools as white Americans. Sometimes they were prevented from their right to vote, but it continued through several things. Sometimes they couldn't ride buses in the same section as white people. And there were several laws like these that segregated them from American life, that separated them to need different systems. Like I mentioned, they couldn't attend the same universities. So that was part of the effects of these. And the laws that prevented them from having these rights were called Jim Crow laws. And they were present through a lot of the American South, but it wasn't only about the South. There were other parts of the US where discrimination existed as well. The civil rights movement was a movement more than anything to end discrimination and to move into a new period of history where Black Americans had equality in the US. Dr. King was a leader in this movement. And one of the reasons he was a leader was the methods that he suggested, and the most prominent of which is nonviolent direct action. This is a bit complicated to explain today, but he preached the value of nonviolence when you seek your goals and when you fight for your rights. And we say direct action because even though it was nonviolent, it was not something that people could forget. He brought the problem straight to political leaders' faces so that they could not be ignored. He made Black equality something that America could not ignore through a series of actions. So when we say actions, we say things like the Montgomery bus boycott. He was inspired by other activists like Mahatma Gandhi in India. And these actions, like the Montgomery bus boycott, would try to change a system. Montgomery is a city in the southern US where they had a bus system. And as I mentioned, Black Americans could not ride the same part of the bus as white people. They had to sit in the back of the bus. Rosa Parks, another activist, once tried to board a bus and they asked her to move to the back and she refused. And she was eventually kicked off the bus for that. This was part of an action that Dr. King, along with many other leaders, including Rosa Parks, planned. For more than a year after that, Black Americans stopped riding the buses so that they stopped getting their money. And it was a boycott, and I think it's the same. And boycott in English basically means you refuse your services. You refuse to use a service or a business to pressure them to do something. In this case, to pressure them to end segregated buses and allow Black people to ride the same part of the bus. Now, he's most known for the I Have a Dream speech. He gave a series of speeches throughout his life. But here in Washington, D.C., where I live, this was a huge rally with several 100,000 people in Washington, D.C. And he spoke from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, one of the landmarks here in Washington, D.C., and gave a speech about his wish for the country, about his dream for the country. And in this speech, he talked about his dream that his children could grow up in a country where they would not be discriminated against for the color of their skin. But I mentioned this last because a lot of people only think about this speech when he actually worked throughout his life for equality. So here's why we remember him and why it was important to make his birthday a holiday. The civil rights movement was not very long ago. This was only in the 1960s. You saw on the first slide, he's playing with his daughter. His children are still alive today. They're on Twitter, they're in the news, and they still do campaigns for justice and equality. That's because the work is not over. Even though the Jim Crow laws have ended, there was still a lot of work to do so that Black Americans could have true equality. Having Dr. King's birthday as a holiday is a way of remembering that that work is not over and that he was a real person and that we can learn from his example to continue to seek justice in our country. He never ended his work. He was organizing a next phase of his campaign called the Poor People's Campaign, and he was going to shift his focus to talk about poverty in America, to talk about helping the poor. And he was organizing an action for that in Memphis, Tennessee, when he was assassinated. He was killed because of what he represented. So we're inspired by his example to continue seeking justice in America today and to remember what it was that he died for. And we're inspired by his message that all of this has to come from a place of love, that when we want equality for our fellow citizens, that when we want justice for them, it is because of the love that we have for other people, um, and that love should drive everything that we do. So this is a very, very incomplete list, but there's a couple things that you can read or watch if you would ever like to see more. There are two movies that I've seen that discuss Dr. King's life. I mean, there are a few, but two examples are the movies Selma and the movie Boycott. Selma, for example, talks about one of Dr. King's marches, the Selma to Montgomery March. And this was a very important event in American history, and something that, and this is a good movie to watch if you'd like to see a bit more about what his life was like. You can read his writing also. The letter from Birmingham jail is an important one. Dr. King was arrested many, many times for his campaigns. It's important to remember that the governments of these states, and sometimes the government of the United States, tried to stop his work and arrested him many times for what he did. And he wrote this very eloquent letter from when he was in the Birmingham jail that explained his principles. And of course, you can read the I Have a Dream speech. There's a lot of music, a very, very long list of music that has come from the civil rights movement. But I have just one example here, the song We Shall Overcome, which has become an international song. And I think is known, if you're able to find it, you'll recognize the tune because it's a known song that in almost every country. So that's it for my first presentation, but I'd be ready to discuss a little more if you'd like.
Mhm. Thank you very much, Abhi, for this wonderful presentation. It was really informative. And we started to receive questions. So 1 second, please. It's almost everywhere the questions we receive from YouTube, Facebook, and WhatsApp. The first question for you, did Martin Luther King receive the Nobel Prize?
So no, I don't believe he did. And I think part of it is that the Nobel Prize did not focus on his struggle at the time. I think he got a commemoration at the Nobel ceremony, but not the prize itself. But other civil rights leaders have received the prize, drawing inspiration from his work.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Abhi, for your answer. The next question is, how the US celebrate the Martin Luther King Day?
Sure. So yeah, that's something I could have talked about a bit more. So I'll go a bit back to my slides a little bit.
Sure.
And that goes back to what I said about a day on, not a day off.
Mm-hmm.
So as I said, the day off, when we say that in American English, that usually means that you're not working that day. A day on is meant to be a twist on that idea, where you do volunteer service on the day of his birthday. So most Americans, they do volunteer service, but it's important to remember the reason for the holiday sometimes. So it's important for the volunteer service not to just be anything, but to be connected to his historical legacy. I think that's something that is important for Americans to remember, and sometimes we forget a little bit too easily. But people might work to improve their schools, they might work to improve their neighborhoods, or I think one good interpretation is to do something for the poor on his birthday, whether it's volunteering at a shelter for the homeless, or to donate money or food or supplies for the poor.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I like it. Like a day on, not a day off. It's so deep meaning in this sentence.
Mhm.
Thank you very much, Abby. The next question is how Martin Luther King changed the world.
he changed the world in so many ways. I think I think first we should remember what he actually did in his life. These actions that I talked about, these became the main way that Americans who are seeking rights fight for their rights. Nonviolence became an important principle for activists in the US. But it's important to remember that nonviolence is not something you can ignore. It's direct. You still make the problem too big to ignore. So he inspired activists in the US who have continued for now more than a half century to follow his example to fight for their rights, whether it's Black people or Indigenous people or Hispanic people or other minorities in the US. It no matter what your category, we learn from this example, but especially Black political movements and rights movements have borrowed from his tradition. There are still a lot of Black reverends in the US who lead rights campaigns in the US. That's an important tradition. But he, like you said, he also inspired big parts of the world because I think American history is very difficult to ignore. And when there were rights movements in other parts of the world, like against the apartheid movement in South Africa, for example, or continued battles for rights in India, for example, a lot of these other countries have looked to the civil rights movement as a model for how they can achieve equality in their own country. And I think that's his legacy, is that legacy of nonviolent direct action.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much, Abby. The next question is, what does mean federal holiday?
Yes, so federal is basically a different way of saying it's a national holiday, but it refers to the government. So when we say federal in the US, we mean the national government because it's not a state government. So some states have their own holidays, but when we call something a federal holiday, that means all 50 states celebrate it. And
Mm-hmm.
most workplaces use the federal calendar to determine what days they don't work. So a federal holiday is one that almost everybody in the US celebrates.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Abby. The next question, did Martin Luther King's children continue on the ideology of Martin Luther King?
Yes, so his children are very active. His son is also named Martin Luther King, and because Martin Luther King we're discussing is Jr., which means the second, his son
Mm-hmm.
is Luther King the third, and his daughter Bernice is also active. And both of them are very important figures today. Both of them were campaigning in Georgia just this month still. Both of them had a lot to say on his birthday, and they're very active on this holiday to remind people of the legacy of their father. But they also fight in other parts of American life to continue the mission.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much, Abby. This was our last question for you. It was so wonderful to have you today. We learned so many things about Martin Luther King. Oh, sorry, one more question. Can I ask you?
Of course.
What interesting fact do you know about Martin Luther King that you couldn't find on the internet?
Oh, that's difficult because he had a very complicated life. So actually, this is an interesting story. I talked about Atlanta, Georgia earlier, and like I said, it's one of the biggest cities in the U.S. And it was so important during the civil rights movement that it was so important to the civil rights movement because there's a large Black population there, because it's like the center uh, of Black cultural life in so many ways in the U.S. And there was a baseball team there, the
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta Braves, and I'm a baseball fan. And one of the greatest players of all time was Hank Aaron, and Hank Aaron was also black, and he was not yet setting records. He was still a young player, but Dr. King convinced him to come and play in Atlanta because he recognized that sports are also a way of sending your message, of expressing your values. So it was very important to him. He convinced Hank Aaron to move to Atlanta and play for the baseball team there, because he recognized that Hank Aaron was going to be a very famous player, and he thought that would be a very important message to America, to have the greatest black player alive play in Atlanta and be part of that movement.
Mm, it's a great story. Thank you very much, Abby, for sharing it. So I think it was the last question for now. Thank you very much, Abby. It was really interesting to learn more about the legacy of the greatest person in the world, Dr. Martin Luther King. And thank you very much. And it's time to say goodbye to our viewers. And please stay healthy, everyone. And see you in our next sessions. And thank you very much, Abby.
Of
Thank you.
course, thank you for inviting me.
So, bye bye. Have a great day. Have a great evening.